About 40,000 years ago, a man in a cave drew a picture on the wall. It was the image of an animal he had seen. This was a momentous occasion because this was the first time in history that information had been stored externally outside of the human body. It was equally momentous because this image of the animal was a reflection of the animal. In other words, it was a concept. And for the first time, man had used a concept. And as we all know, when we have concepts, we can combine them. And of course, that gives us creativity. And with creativity, we can do many things, one of which is to create technology. And if you look back in history, you'll notice that before that point, 40,000 years ago, there was no technology in human history. Now, if a man has information stored externally and he has technology, then he has something of value, something that he can share. And how does he share it? By participating in networks. And as he networks, he meets more people and the networks get bigger. And if he introduces barter and he introduces money, and then we have sailing ships, eventually we have commerce, and we end up with what we have today, which are very large, interconnected global networks. And now we realize how important networks are. And if you study network science, yes, there is a science of networks, what you'll discover is that small, disorganized networks always have one dominant node. And if you look at US history, up until about 1900, all of the networks of humans, of people, were small and disorganized. And what was the dominant node that emerged? Well, that dominant node was government. And with government, what I've done is I've just completed telling you about a four-part framework: information, technology, networks, and government. And this four-part framework can explain all of human behavior. It can explain political, social, and economic behavior by man. Now, I want you to remember this network and this framework because we're going to come back to it. We're going to come back to it in a minute. But first, I want to roll forward to today. And if we look at the world, we see one group of countries that are very wealthy. The people are very well off. For example, we could think of the countries in North America. There's a second group of countries, and these countries, they're not as well off as North America, but they're doing reasonably well. You could think of most of the countries in South America as an example. And then we have a third group of countries, and these are the 60 poorest countries in the world. And in these countries, the people live in abject poverty. Yes, they live in abject poverty, not much better off than my friend in the cave. And how many people live in these 60 poorest countries? 1.4 billion people. 1.4 billion people live in abject poverty. And now, of course, what you realize is that in 40,000 years of advances in technology and economic development and the accumulation of wealth, after these 40,000 years, we still have 1.4 billion people living in poverty. Now let's use my framework and see if we can explain why these people are living in poverty. I realize it's a little dark, but how many people think that networks, sharing and trusting other people, causes poverty? Show of hands. Anybody? I don't see any hands. That's a good thing. I would like to think that trusting and sharing people does not create poverty. What about technology? Does anybody think that technology causes poverty? Well, not even Piketty thinks that technology causes poverty. Third choice, does anybody think that information causes poverty? Raise your hand or wave your hand if you think that information causes poverty. You're now all about to understand why you have never won a Nobel Prize. Because Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winning economist and the former dean at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, in a recent book said that poverty was caused by a negative asymmetry of information. Poverty was caused by a negative asymmetry of information. What does that mean? It means that if you have better information than I do, you can take advantage of me. And if you consistently have better information than I have, you consistently take advantage of me, and that makes me poor. So a negative asymmetry of information causes poverty. At this point, you should be asking yourselves one question: what creates the negative asymmetry? And perhaps, much to your surprise, it's the fourth part of my framework. It's the government that may be a major contributor to poverty. How can that be? Well, first of all, how do we get most of our information? Most of our information comes through communications networks. Who regulates and licenses communications networks? Well, in almost every country in the world, it's the government. So if you don't have access to a communication network to get information, you have a negative asymmetry of information, and most likely it's caused by the government. There's another way that the government creates the negative asymmetry of information. Every law and every regulation gives a preference to a group, a preferred group. And whenever you have a preferred group, you have a second group, and that's the group that's discriminated against. And whenever you're in the discriminated group, or the group that is not the preferred group, you do not have the same access to information as the preferred. And if you don't have the same access to information, you have a negative asymmetry of information. Now, I kind of like this explanation that the government is the cause or the fundamental reason that we have poverty. But there's one problem with that concept, with that theory, and that is it doesn't really help us to solve the problem of poverty. But I have a story which I think makes very clear what is the solution to poverty. In 2009, I joined a project called One Laptop Per Child. One Laptop Per Child was a project that started at MIT at the Media Lab. And the purpose of the project was to provide a modern education to every child in the developing world through a connected laptop. That would be a laptop connected to the internet. And after about 6 months working on this project, I started to hear stories that One Laptop projects around the world were spawning entrepreneurship. Now, just to be clear, it was not the children in the One Laptop Per Child projects that were becoming entrepreneurs. That would have been too perfect. But in fact, it was their parents that were becoming entrepreneurs. And this interested me because I am a professor of entrepreneurship. There was only one problem. The professor could not explain why this entrepreneurship was taking place. So I started reading, and I first read about economic development theory. And after 9 months of reading about this stuff, I concluded that economic development theory doesn't explain anything, least of all entrepreneurship. And so then I went back and I started to reread my books on entrepreneurship. And one day, I'm reading a book by Israel Kirzner. And in this book, Israel Kirzner says that entrepreneurship is caused by a positive asymmetry of information. Entrepreneurship is caused by a positive asymmetry of information. What does that mean? It means simply that the entrepreneur draws out an insight, and that insight becomes the basis of his business concept and his entrepreneurship. And while I was pondering what Kerzner was saying about positive asymmetries, I remembered what Michael Spence had said, and Michael Spence had said, of course, that poverty is caused by a negative asymmetry of information. And looking at these two ideas together, of course, I had my eureka moment, and I knew why one laptop per child was spawning these entrepreneurship efforts. And the answer was very simple. One laptop per child was providing connection to the internet, and this was giving these parents, for the first time in their life, unlimited access to information. And what were they doing with this unlimited access to information? Well, they were using it to overcome their biggest problem. And their biggest problem, of course, was their poverty. And how did they do it? They extracted an insight from the information. They started economic activity. And this became the entrepreneurship which they believed, and which I believe, was the path to overcoming their poverty. Now, hearing about asymmetry of information may be a little hard to digest the first time. So I have another example which I think makes the point very understandable. One of the greatest acts of philanthropic contribution in the history of the United States was done by Andrew Carnegie. And what Carnegie's money did was it built the network of public libraries in the United States. And many analysts believe that this network of libraries is one of the principal factors to explain the economic success of the United States in the 20th century. And when you look at what Carnegie did with his libraries, what he did was he provided unlimited access to information for the people. And what did the people do? They extracted their insights, they started their companies, they became entrepreneurs in order to overcome their poverty. And this wave of entrepreneurship is what created the enormous economic success in the United States. What we see is that Andrew Carnegie and Israel Kerzner and these poor people in these remote parts of the world where OLPC was, where one laptop per child was, they all understood the same concept, which is if you empower people by giving them access to information, they can manage their lives, create economic activity, and overcome their poverty. And so if we come back to the 1.4 billion people living in abject poverty in the 60 poorest countries in the world, don't look to the government or charitable foundations or NGOs to solve the problem. Empower the people, give them access to information, they will draw their own insights, they will become entrepreneurs, and they will overcome their poverty.